Welcome to another episode of Indigenous Intelligence. This morning we have Ade Sawyer, who is a management consultant who works primarily with African heritage and organizations and businesses assisting to resolve seemingly intractable issues around social, economic, and political advancement. He's passionate about finding the keys to integration to enable these communities to thrive. He's also a cultural enthusiast promoting the history and culture and traditions of the Gadangbe people of Ghana. As a social political commentator, he writes about social and economic development in Ghana and Africa and is a Pan-Africanist who champions the vision of Osajifo Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. Originally from Ghana, he's lived and worked from London, Brixton, and Croydon for the past 40 years, and lately a patient advocate of sickle cell disease. Welcome, welcome to Indigenous Intelligence, Ade Sawyer.
Thank you very much for having me.
I've been keen to have you on, and obviously we've kind of had some of these conversations in the past, so it's nice to finally record something that we can leave, and then hopefully someone will stumble on it and listen and maybe get some insights. But as I said, Indigenous intelligence essentially does what you do. Your biography talks about being a cultural enthusiast and promoting the history and culture and traditions of the Gadangbe people. So I want to explore that. I guess in Ghana we call it kusum, but indigenous intelligence is just a nice Eurocentric way to say kusum. Um, so I just want to start with, can you share a bit of a background about how ancestral practice connects to indigenous wisdom? I guess the question is, can you share a bit about your background
Okay.
and how it connects to ancestral indigenous practice? Kusum.
Okay. Well, I mean, what's interesting is that I was brought up in Accra, which is a more cosmopolitan, urbanized city. I grew up in Jamestown. We call Jamestown British Accra, and I use British Accra advisedly to show that there were differences like Dutch Accra and Danish Accra, which hark back from the colonization of our people. So I grew up as what I would call a totally detribalized Ghanaian who was actually looking more at immersing myself in economic, social, and political issues. Um, in my 30s, I traveled to England, and it was in England that there was a bit of awakening about my identity. Um, I studied in Manchester, and there were several classmates of mine who really wanted to know how I would come from Africa and know quite a lot about the British system and also know a lot about their own customs and traditions, which are things that I upheld. So the search for who I really am probably started in Manchester, where I had to tell them who I was and how come I came from Ghana and how come I knew about the English way of life and how probably I lived it much in the same way as they did. Okay. After almost 10 years in this country without going back to Ghana, I I went back to visit my father, and he took me to see quite a few relatives who had been asking about me. Specifically, he took me to Teshi, where it is that he came from. And there was something that I noticed on that visit, which was that when I was welcomed by my uncle and auntie, he asked for my father to pour libation for my return to safely back home, even though I wasn't coming to stay, but it was just a visit. And I noticed that my father turned round and asked him that, oh, Akwete, you are the younger one, and it is your house that we've come to visit. So you pour the libation and ask for blessings for my son, uh, which Akwete did willingly. Okay. So on the way home, I started exploring with my father about how people around Teshi were deeply immersed in their culture and tradition, though they were also senior civil servants uh, and the like, and how growing up he had never shared with us all these issues about our traditions and culture, though he had always adhered to them. And he sort of took me aside and said that, look, there were pressures on them in the 30s and 40s when they were working with the colonial people. So, yes, they knew all the customs and everything, but maybe they did not openly practice them because the colonial masters, that's the British at that time, would actually frown on the fact that they, who probably had been educated in England to take the heights of the servants, would have gone native. And so, yes, he knew about all those. He encouraged us to go into all those, but he himself really did not practice that. So I went out to around the Mokola area, and I bought as many books on the Ghana culture and religion and history as I could find. And I came back to England, and that coincided with our setting up of what we would call a Gandangbe Nikase Mwansafo, which is an educational and cultural society that sought to mediate our culture onto our children born in this country. So we help them in terms of um, making sure that we attend all our cultural practices. Like when young people were born, we willingly went to engage in introducing them into the world, outdooring, which is what is called. We also then celebrated our annual festival of Homo War every year. And whenever there were people who sort of passed on, we helped with the rites of passage for them into a new world. And I would also say that when people were getting married, we had a group. And then we started a school that taught people Ghana, which worked every Saturday. So I sort of immersed myself away from my consultant work in actually trying to also be at par and within my cultural practices, especially since I worked with African heritage organizations. In brief, this has been my journey.
Okay, I'm interested in. So I'm as I listen, I was wondering about the the story with your father. So you're saying that your awakening kind of came when you moved to the UK.
Yeah.
because you talked about, moving to the UK and then moving back and then your father having this conversation. But I think this is really an important point of our discussion because I think for any listeners out there, it highlights the complexity of dealing with the colonialists because today's generations, some of the rhetoric can be um, can be a little critical of how some of our um, fathers or grandfathers, maybe for want of another word, toe the line, as in they was it a fear? When you move into the diaspora, you run into a lot of diasporans who talked about, why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? And I think some of these personal stories kind of explains the difficulty in navigating those parallels, as in, in the what late 1900s, Africans were being educated, and then you would come back and you'd have to find the balance between being educated and being native, and also not trying to espouse this um, colonialist mindset, you know. But it's interesting as you talk because you said your father never really shared these things with you because he had to balance the relationship with the colonial society. And I think I thought that was interesting because it's easy to be critical and say, oh, why weren't they more militant or resistant? But I think sometimes we lose sight of some of the things that went on during the times. Survival. There's so many things that go into that. But that's interesting. That's interesting. So you go through this libation, and then you buy these books from Mokola, and you come back. Do you remember the titles of any of those books?
Well, there were several. I mean, I had a social organization of the Ghana people, the history and medicine of the Ghana people. I bought books like Adote and Kobe. I actually went to Legon and got a book,
What
which is,
what year was this?
this was in 1989,
Okay,
I think. Yes,
okay.
1989. But as you talk about the life of people like my father, was that they had been educated at Achimota School. They had been educated, primed for the civil service. What they essentially did was that they lived dual lives. So they lived the life of their work, which was probably to enlighten our people in the ways of of the British and how the British did things, so that the British would recognize that they also probably were a little bit modernist. But after work, they came into their communities and they still indulged in in what it is or what is the culture and tradition of their people. They probably was not overly enthusiastic, okay? And don't forget, because they came from Accra, which now is the urbanized capital of, of Ghana, uh, there weren't that many occasions where they would probably lead some of these customs and some of these traditions. So they did it as a matter of course. Okay. Now, if you come to somebody like me, I went to school, and the primary school that I went to was an experimental school, which meant that we were not allowed to speak our local indigenous language or even learn it. Okay, so I was at a disadvantage when I went to a secondary school that suggested that people should be fluent in their local language, should be accustomed to their traditions, doing tribal dancing and drumming, as they called it, and doing the study of Ghana, because if you were Ghana, you had to go and study Ghana. So I was a bit deficient about that. But it did not hurt me because most of the things, transactions that we did, work otherwise, was always in the English language. And I spoke Ghana quite fluently at home. And I did things that were in tune with my culture. But I was also very comfortable doing things that were supposedly British. It did not mean that I negated what my culture was, but I never really thought about it in terms of looking at my identity. So, yes, there was this mask of colonization that probably affected me. And it was when I came into this country that you then realize that here you are trying to be probably as English as you are in order to get on with your career in Ghana. And yet, when you come here, people see you as a foreigner. So, the search for my identity at that stage really became pronounced. That who am I? Who am I really? Am I a Ghanaian-born person in a British way who lived that kind of life, or am I really a person who can still maintain my Ghana identity, which was kind of different and probably more refreshing for me as a human being? So, what it then meant was that though I had studied in English and done everything that would promote my modernity, it was kind of refreshing to go back and actually think through some of the things that were our traditional customs that I would say I had taken for granted. So for me, there was about now um, not trying to explain, but trying to understand why I did some of those things and trying to understand the nuances and meanings of my cultural practices. Now, I say that was refreshing because I had other people who were also passionate about this. So we're able to explore them together. And I'm saying that that has been my reality of living in England. So though I would eat salad and eat a full English breakfast, I was very much at home with banku and egg flour and komi and Kentucky, as my friend would say. So that's really the still living the dualism, but still very much looking at how our traditions and customs had served us and continue to serve us. I don't know whether
That's
I've given
interesting.
full meaning.
Oh, you did. You gave me more than even I asked. You gave me. I'm trying to figure out what to pull apart. But yes, you did answer that. I think that explanation helps anyone out there who is trying to reconcile dealing with their indigenous Kusum or African or indigenous ancestry with Western civilization or religion. But I want to circle back to Achimota School because I went there and I studied in Lugard House. My father was in Lugard House. I had an uncle, James Okyne, in Lugard House. I had two cousins in Lugard House. So I mean, the Okynes, there's been maybe 7 or 8 of us who were all in Lugard House. And while I was in school, much as we kind of celebrated or we had a place for African tradition, it was it was looked down upon because it was almost like Western civilization and Western education was a step up. So, for example, we weren't allowed to speak vernacular when I was in the school. Vernacular wasn't permitted. But on Founders Day, we had the all the African celebrations. But the I guess I'm speaking to decolonizing because it's a balance that every African who's colonized has to strike within between how you practice your ancestry and how you understand it, and reconciling that with Western civilization. You reference, I eat my banku and I also eat my English breakfast. So that was good to understand because I think it's difficult for people to navigate, especially living in the West. There's a lot that people have to give up. I want to talk about the I guess the question is, what does all of this mean to you in terms of your African identity, your kusum? What does it mean to you personally? You reference identity. So I guess the question is, what does kusum, what does indigenous intelligence mean to you personally?
Well, I think that is kind of fairly important. Let me also claw back to Achimota School, which is the school I went to. During our time, actually, it was kind of refreshing to say that the school was very much interested in our cultural practices and in our actually leading a life as what do you call it, Ghanaians at that time. I think the school changed a little bit because during our time there were people who actually came from the hinterland, and there was also this affirmative action to ensure that a lot more people who did not come from Accra and therefore were not Gans came from all over, so that we're all meshed together and we're actually sort of, what would I say, put in this melting pot to actually turn us out as probably the leaders in Ghana, for want of a better word. My
Let me ask this. So when you say turn the leaders, I wanna break that down because sometimes I find, maybe this is my personal observation, that sometimes, not in your case, but I've seen Achimotans who seem to represent more of the Western ideologies than they do the indigenous or African traditions. And I don't know, this is my observations from many generations or many year groups. But I want to ask this question. Lugard House, for example, as you're a well-read historian, you'd be familiar with Lord Lugard
Lugard,
and
yeah, who
his
created Nigeria, whose wife
his
helped him
governor,
in the
exactly,
creation of Nigeria. Okay.
whose governorship took place in Nigeria, and his wife. I've seen references of how she even came up with the name of the country.
Yep.
But I guess the question is, so for me, I got to a point where I was like, look, what are we doing in terms of decolonizing? Okay, because the name is still maintained. And
Yeah.
this is an individual who was very condescending towards
Yeah.
Africans and African ideologies. And it's not just him. You know, some of the other boarding houses are named
I
after
was in Gajisberg, so
Gudgesberg. Okay,
I was
so
named as the person who had the idea of founding the school, and he did that because he was a quantity surveyor. So his thing was about building things. So he built Achimota. He helped to build the hospital, Kolebu Hospital, and there were some
Gudgesberg,
also.
not so much. Gudgesberg, I mean, he what I've read doesn't. Gudgesberg invited Kwejiagri to join him. So that kind of says to me that he had maybe not as condescending views on the African
Yeah.
perspective as Lugard. So I'll give Gudgesberg a pass. But how about Lugard? How about
Livingston,
Livingston? How
who
about
did
the
who
Clarks,
discovered?
Mary Clarks, Mary Slessor,
Yeah.
Mary Kingsley?
Okay. Yeah.
How about how do you feel about
Well,
maintaining those names in terms of decolonizing as Africans?
well, okay. I mean, I look about decolonizing in a different way actually, and I think for me the paradox of our lives was resolved years ago when I started delving into my customs and my traditions. And I think the reason why I resolved it is that um, I was not deficient at all in terms of being able to hold my own within the English system. So if I take two things, if you invite me to a wedding, which is an English wedding, I can go through the rules of the wedding, when the father-in-law has to speak, when the grooms have to do this and that. And when I go to an African traditional wedding, I also know my place in it. So for me, what I'm saying is that the dualism is actually, instead of my negating my African traditions, has actually allowed me to probably to be more au fait and more consummate in practicing both the English and the Ga. And so it sort of rather put my identity in full circle, that I can go somewhere where if English is the medium and English is what needs to be done, I can do it. And people marvel, oh, what's this African doing trying to be one of us? And I can then go out there amongst my Ghana people and actually better appreciate what it is that we do and giving probably more full meaning to the fact that despite colonialization, we've still been able to maintain our cultural practices. We still understand very much so our traditions and why we had those traditions. And I think that for me is probably a source of pride, that I can navigate different things and without negating one. Uh, so if I were in the presence of my people, like amongst Ghana people, I would assume that all the protocols are upheld in terms of everything that we do. And I think the fact that I know it and I know these things actually gives me some sort of, what I would say, satisfaction that I haven't quite, despite all colonization tried to do, I haven't quite lost who it is that I am. And I will sort of lately how that related to South Africa, where I spent some little time. My friends who were very much within the anti-apartheid movement, and I remember one of them who understood, wrote Afrikaans, but he refused to speak Afrikaans to his colleagues who were white, who he worked with in the African practice, in their practice. So there was this balance about somebody talking to him in Afrikaans, uh, and he answering back in Soto, which is his language. And he said he went on for a very long time, and the people wondered whether he did not understand the Afrikaans or he understood it and pretended that he would not speak it. But what he said was, I said, look, there's this adjustment. Now we've gone after apartheid and we need to build our nation. And before apartheid, Afrikaans was what people spoke in the workplace. They did not speak English. So they spoke Afrikaans to now exclude us. So if somebody spoke to me in Afrikaans, I would answer in Soto. If somebody spoke to me in English, then we can talk about our English. But it means that I have superior knowledge because I understood or understand everything that he is saying, but I'm not quite sure whether he understands what it is that I'm saying. So for me, decolonization is or could be important. But because I have lived and been able to navigate through both cultures, maybe I'm not very much a proponent of decolonization. I'd also say something, and this has been a very interesting thing for me that our forefathers accepted colonization. They did not quite condone it, but they accepted it because they felt that it was something that would give us some advancement. Maybe wrongly so, but it was the chiefs who accepted it because they were the people who signed the pact with the what I call the colonial masters. But increasingly, the people who then worked to reshape the system. And the British did it in a, how would I say, colonization in a very clever way. Because what they instituted on us was something that was called indirect rule. So they came up with things and they did not implement them themselves, but they implemented them through our chiefs. So during the colonial period, we had no constitution because the British did not have a written constitution. It was more conventions, and they did the same thing when they came to Africa, specifically Ghana. Okay. Now, the agitation for our independence was really an agitation against our chiefs because essentially what they were telling the colonial masters was that now you have educated us. You've taken us through Achimota, you've brought us to Oxford, Cambridge, whatever it is. We are back now serving our countries. How can you possibly think that the chiefs are the people and you should still maintain indirect rule? So there was an agitation for educated Africans to actually join the ruling class, which they did. So there were some notable people, Mensa Saba, people like Evin and Cabrus, E.C. Quist, several people who were part of the agitation to ensure that there will now be, instead of the joint provisional council of chiefs, there will now be a proper legislative assembly where educated Africans who were better educated than the governors and the people who were sent would actually now work hand in hand with the chiefs to govern our country. What is interesting was that they had been products of colonization. They did not, they probably acquiesced to colonization, but they ensured that really they were going to do what they knew of both systems. Okay. Our major problem came at independence when now the British, who had ruled us without a constitution, insisted that if they were leaving our countries, we should be saddled with a constitution. And so in Ghana, that's our initial experience came with the writing and rewriting of many constitutions that will then take us into independence. So decolonization has been a very torturous process. And for all that we we talk about, we still seem to be fairly grateful that colonization has helped us in one way or the other.
You said something that I wanna clarify because your words were our chiefs accepted colonialism. I think differently of our chiefs accepting colonialism. I think it was more nuanced than that. I think when you track through the history of Africa, religion has always been a currency to trade, and unsuspectingly, certain things have come with it. But I struggle to reconcile our chiefs accepting something that would limit their power because we fought these ideas. What we wanted to do was trade and have access to some of these supposed advancements in technology that was being sold to us. I kind of saw the story more as our chiefs not really understanding the pacts and agreements and conventions or constitutions that they were a part of. A lot because they obviously did not understand the English language that it was written in. But I feel like the the description of acceptance might counter my interpretation of what actually took place. Not to say that I mean I definitely in certain ways I'm similar to you, educated in English and have studied extensively and lived out and lived in the diaspora for years. So I can't take away from that. But I guess personally, the more I delve into my identity and understand more about my culture, I start to get a better understanding, and the picture is a lot clearer in how things took place. I guess the question about decolonization is not so much the it's not so much the I guess let me say this specifically, for example, let me go back to the naming of these boarding houses. Yes, decolonization means different things to different people, but should we maintain the names of, for example, Lugard in the spirit of um, look, it's a part of our history, it's there, we might as well just reconcile it and let it be. What would you think of an alternate idea that would potentially name the house something else? There's a small plaque in the house saying, at one time, this used to be called Lugard House, because it seems that,
Okay.
yeah,
Uh,
so that's
yeah. I
that, I
know.
guess
I know.
that's the
I know. I
question.
know. I know where you are driving at, and I
I
understand the
guess the
question.
question is about
Let me.
it's about
Let
Lugard
me.
House and the naming of that and the
Yeah.
naming of the houses.
But
What do you
but
think about that?
okay. But let me give you the reality of present day. Okay. My father was named Jacob. My father named me as his third son, Jacob Williamson. And when I asked him, why did you give me a name, Jacob Williamson? He said, oh, when I was studying in Furabe, there was a guy called Jacob Williamson, white guy, who really influenced my life. But if you look at both families that I come from, Jacob and Williamson are prominent, so I gave it to you. And then I also gave you an indigenous name. Okay. When I had my son, and I went to him as I should to get a name for my son, he gave me a typical um, indigenous name, African name, and said that he did not think that I should add an English name to it. I mean, we live in Ghana. People are still naming their children by English names, and people are proudly calling themselves by English names. And the same people are the people who are driving force thinking about this decolonization. And I'm saying that one would have wished that this fervor of our thinking through our colonial thing without accepting it wholeheartedly, or that is where we will start. That will start by saying that we are changing our things, and we expect then that we can then change things in the public space. But people are still naming their children biblical names, English names. Even now, people are adding exotic French names and created names, which are all really English sounding. So that is where I'm coming from. I'm saying that if we are able to actually resolve that, then we can then talk about fully decolonizing. But we still hold on to the relics of this colonization, even passionately, we do so. And for some people, and I'm not included in that, we actually see that as a hallmark of modernity. We actually see that as really what development is about. That we can now replace our cherished maize dishes with a lot of rice growing up, and I just bounded. I'll take the religion later on, but growing up, people hardly ate rice in their homes. Once a week was what we did. Now more rice is imported into our country. Nobody wants to eat the different aspects of our food, which is probably a little bit more nourishing. And we are now thinking about now trying to plant rice to compete with rice that comes from Asia. It's a no-brainer for me. We can't do that. Let's go back to what it is that we knew. So there's always this kick about the fact that by doing Western things, we think that we are better, or we think that those things will help us in a better way. So that's where I stand on decolonization.
So should we change the name of the guardhouse? Because you've essentially, I mean, I mean, what I'm hearing from you is yes, I'm hearing. Look, we need to. You reference the food, what we eat. You reference the names. You know, in celebrating these things, yes, should we consider celebrating our name and putting our name on these boarding houses instead of what they are now? As in the way I mean, you're obviously an advocate for us to eat less rice, an advocate for us to return to our names. Are you an advocate to change the names of some of these colonial structures that still remain and still maintain names of things that don't necessarily serve us?
Well, you don't use an English name, but there are people who are advocating for this name change who still use their English names. So I'm saying that they need to go and actually say that, look, these are things that we are rejecting. So let's reject them in total, but not reject them publicly and still hang on to uh, our names, and the fact that we still continue to name our children, giving them English names. And I'm saying that it's only when we've been able to do that that we can then say with confidence that, okay, we are now knocking off Lugard House is going, uh, Cadbury, despite all that the Cadbury firm has done for us in terms of contributing to the school. We knock that off. We knock Gettysburg off, and then we start naming, realistically naming the names. So yes, I would support that if the people advocating for that actually do decolonize themselves.
Okay. All right. Okay, that's good. That's cool. All right. So let's so I mean clearly, we're obviously on this subject of colonialism, but just to kind of pivot back to this ancient indigenous Kusum culture.
Okay.
How do you, as an individual, what aspects of indigenous culture or traditions do you practice? How do you
Okay.
practice
Um,
them? What do you incorporate into your daily routine? Which practices do you,
well,
or your monthly routine?
I would say that as a Gan, and as a Gan who has now delved a little bit into the liturgy of outdooring, which is Pujimo, I recognize that the words that are said to the child, even at that the child is not conscious, are fairly important because I think that that's what really helps to dictate what the child will live into. And to think that on the eighth day of when a child is born, that child is brought out of the room in which they were born to actually face the family and to be introduced formally to the family and to be given a name in front of the family. And it's to be given, in some cases, a predestined name in the front of the family because those are the names that run through a particular bloodline. Okay. I think that's very interesting and also fairly refreshing. And it's actually the way we welcome children. Probably not unique, but fairly significant in the sense that we actually then get the person who would be the godfather, so to speak, to actually speak to the child when the child may not understand, but actually to tell the child who he or she is, where he or she comes from, and try talk about asking for blessings for the mother, for the father, um, the fact that they came from some darkness into light, and the fact that we standing there are encouraging them to come and work so that they would be able to help support the systems of the family. And that also then actually affirming that they are there and whenever they are in difficulty, it is the family who would bind them and help them and, and then giving them the admonition of Amali Aju, you don't tell lies, you don't steal. I think that the liturgy is sort of so fascinating for me, and the fact that this has been transferred with general over the generations, and that then builds an identity for a Ghana-born child, which is saying that never forget your family because it is your family that helped you come into being. Refreshing, talked about family bonds, talked about how family can help people to thrive, talk about respect for parents, and then give that child the commandments of what determines their life. I don't know too many systems, but what I know is that the English do not have that system. And I think that is fairly interesting. That is something that identifies a Ghana child. The ceremony itself is not only beautiful, but it's replete with meaning, which means that you can always go back and rely on your family. Admittedly, over the years, as people have moved away from, because of work, moving to different countries, and the significance may seem to have been lost a little bit, but it still holds us together. And I think that that is beautiful. And I think that that is something that I would encourage anybody who has a child to go back and look. And it gives meaning to this issue about an individual brings a child into being, but the village is there to look after the child.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, I've seen your video on YouTube, doing the actual practice, and I definitely feel that way. I mean, I'm an advocate for a lot of these things. I don't, like you said, I don't have an English name. I didn't give my children an English name. They're twins. I took them through the twin ritual from the Gas, and I definitely think we should be more. We should put more of a focus on celebrating these things, especially those of us that live outside. So are there any other traditions or elements of your culture that you practice in your daily life? Is there anything specifically cultural that you do on a daily basis? I mean, the Kujimo and stuff, you do that ceremonially, but what do you do in your daily life that represents your Ga tradition?
Well, it's kind of funny because how would I say? I mean, I once had a cousin visiting, and there was an issue about what that cousin wanted to eat. He had lived in England before, and there was a debate with my wife as to what it is that he wanted to eat. And I was plumbing for eating my traditional Ghana food, which is what I thrive on. And she was saying that, look, this guy eats the food every day. So if he's come to England, can we serve them or serve him English food? So I insisted that she sort of cooked both. So he came and we came with his wife, who was English, who we thought would appreciate the English food, except that whilst my uncle wanted to eat English food, the wife, who was English, asked whether we had any indigenous food around. And I won my argument with my wife that yes, in terms of food, I tend to actually prefer eating my Ghanaian food. I worked in Brixton for 25 years. The Brixton market was there. So my fare for lunch was always about going down the market and buying some kenke or buying some wache or something that fully reflected who I was. And I would say that because my palate had been trained to appreciate that, Um, give me African food any day, every day. I'll do it. And on a fortnightly basis, for instance, when I go to Labadi Kitchens down the road in Forest Gate to buy my stock of kenke, I always buy utinshinu. Well, they give it to me free actually. So I drink utinshinu as a matter of course, in addition to relishing really my kenke. And increasingly, I also eat a fair amount of Caribbean food in preference to eating an English type or Chinese or Italian or whatever it is. So my daily life conjures that I actually live as as a Ga, and I probably speak more Ga now in my retirement because most of the people who call to speak to me in Ga. And I would also probably say that though I live in England, I'm probably I've always had an affinity to what is happening back home. So again, I tend to speak to people probably on a daily basis about issues that crop up in Ghana. For the past 2 years, I've actually hosted a radio program. Albeit it's about 2-3 hours a week, but it focuses on development issues back home. So my clothes that I wear are probably fully Ghanaian, especially when I'm going out. And so, yes, I think that I live the life. And I think that my concerns over the period is how maybe or why the development, social and political and economic development has sort of passed us by in Jamestown and Gamashi. So those are things that I'm very much concerned with. Okay. And I do everything possible to help in terms of reshaping that territory so that our people will thrive. Okay. So I can say personally that I feel fairly satisfied that I'm doing my little bit, which is helping to share my knowledge and also helping to reinterpret development within the concept of looking at Accra as a highly urbanized and unplanned area, and how we can navigate to actually rebuild and regenerate those areas.
Okay. Okay, so you're definitely living and breathing all of those things. That's good. It was good to listen to that. I want to ask you about certain aspects of tradition or culture in comparison to religion. So, for example, um, pouring libation, for example, shrines, for example, initiations, rituals. How from a religious standpoint, how do you reconcile those things? As in, maybe I'm just not as well read, but I mean, I was raised in the Christian church, but how does one navigate that path? How does one reconcile um, being a Christian and then also practicing some of these elements of traditions and cultures that are not supposed to be practiced based on religion?
Um, I think I'm a Christian. I was brought up a Christian. And in this discussion, I've sort of highlighted the dualism in our lives as people who were colonized, and the fact that we do our English things, and we also still do our Ghana things. So I long ago resolved that contradiction which people find. I was born a Christian, and I still profess Christianity. Okay. I think that a lot of what happened to us under colonization and a lot of what happened in our worship of Christianity in our country was more cultural than religious. The rituals that were brought to us were very cultural and not religious. I say this that colonization was for an economic reason. I think the people who brought Christianity brought it in a different way. And let's look typically at the Basel mission. They came and they realized that the people, especially at Osu, believed in a God, and that this talk about their accepting God was futile because they had their own God who they worshipped in a particular way. Now, they went through the process of actually translating the Bible into Ghana. And I think that that was kind of very important for us at the time. But the people could not quite adopt the Christianity. A lot of the missionaries passed on because of the harsh realities of living in a tropical climate and going to places where they could not get the proper medical care because they had not developed the kind of immunity that the local population had developed. And so the way in which they propagated the Christianity was to go to Jamaica and bring ethnic African pastors into this country, into Ghana, into Osun, for them to come and learn the language and be able to minister to the people and help propagate their religion. I think in Osu, that was the starting point of actually people really adopting the Basel version of the Christian religion. So people like Hall, Hoyt, Williams, Clark, and I think there was about 25 of them who were brought to help in propagating. It was a very clever move. But you know, in all this, it was the colonial administration who actually insisted that as a sign of loyalty, people will continue to practice Christianity and not practice or adhere to their own religion. So admittedly, when I talk about being a Christian, I talk about being a Christian because that is what I've been conditioned to. I have never really been conditioned to do anything that would be about worshipping other gods. And I'll say that significantly, As a Ga, the Gans live on this issue of being a theocracy, that we have one God, Atananyungo. And that on that Atananyungo are the Jeman who are the spirits. And the spirits are custodians of the earth. So again, I'll stress this. When we outdoor a child, one of the admonitions to the child is that Oyi Abagbojing, that come and respect the earth. And so it tries to give us balance with the things around us, a form of animism, which is to see God in terms of the great things that God has created. I can live with that and also live with the concept of Trinity, which is talking about Christ as a man, as a God, as a spirit, because those nuances run through what I know is Ga religion. The difference is that whereas in the Christian religion, there's a lot of public worship, which is we all congregate in one place on a Saturday, and that though we pray on a daily basis and call on our Lord for our Lord to mediate this passage on the earth with us. As a guy, anytime I say I go Chemekenyeme, tra umanyaba, I have prayed, because at every stage, even my language, it's actually calling on this great Atananyumo and asking for glory to surround us at all times. These days, you can go to church and say tra umanyaba, and it is accepted. It is accepted because what we are all talking about is the worship of, of one God. In the past, when the colonials were there, they prevented us from actually doing that thing. So, where or what are those contradictions that people say? I'm a Ga, so I will not go to a church that I'm older than, and that no later day charismatic can come and reinterpret the Bible for me, when I can perfectly read the Bible, when I can understand that this whole issue about Christianity is about having a God who will protect you and who will lead you into an afterlife where you can still continue in terms of the reincarnation of them. So let's look at the funeral rites. Again, when people die, just like we spoke to them when they are born, when people die, we part with them. And the parting shots that we give to them is to encourage them that where they are going, none of us have been before, but we ask them to go and lead a life of hard work. We give them some money that if they have to navigate, because we give them money because it's our wealthy way, that if they have to navigate, they would at least use some of that money to ease their passage. We also ask them that when they go, they should go and talk to their ancestors, so that the ancestors would actually send angels to come to us, so that they would come and help soften this difficulty that we find in this material world. And we bid them farewell and ask them to help intercede for us I don't see where the contradictions are. I'm an Anglican. When the incense is flowing and the candles are lit and my priests are in different frocks and everything, it's all called cultural to me. It's not about the intent of the religion. And so I don't have that contradiction. And I'll refer you to a book by E.A. Amma. It was written by, when he talks about what is Christianity. And this guy in 1997 wrote to all the priests and all the different houses around and challenged them on why they thought that the Oshi dancing and they thought that our whole issue about homo was something that was ungodly. And it is that challenge that nobody was able to respond to. So if you know what our traditions and religion are, you then realize that there's absolutely no contradiction in terms of what we do in Christianity as to what we do also in our traditional life of a Ghana. I resolved that contradiction long ago. I've written a piece about Christianity, a continuing journey, and it was in that piece that I was able to resolve all this. I don't feel comfortable in a charismatic church. I don't go to church to dance. I go to a disco to dance. When I like my religion, in the reverent one, kneeling down to pray, not standing up to pray, because some pastor has asked me to stand up before I can pray. So yes, I resolve that contradiction. I can still be a Christian and I can still be a Ghan.
Wow, that's thank you for your submission. I mean, it's honest. You know, I hear you. I listened. You know, obviously gave you an opportunity to express what you meant, and I think it's important for some of the listeners who are going to listen. I am probably a piece that you actually shared with me recently about the Basel mission and when they first set up. And it's interesting to note that all of the attempts to settle for any all of the attempts that the Basel group had, they had resistance from the locals. And there is a story of when they first set up the mission, the I don't know why I think it's the La people. When you reference Basel, you said Usu, but what I read said there was a skirmish with the people of La. And apparently the people of La didn't go fishing on a certain day
Tuesday.
and on Tuesday. And they had converted some locals to Christianity and they encouraged the locals to defy or to not align with this local belief for not going to fish on a Tuesday. And this ended up being a huge issue between the locals. So I guess for clarity for me, I always like to pivot back to how it actually came, how we actually started to deal with religion. These we were suspicious because all of the missionaries that came were men. And Africans had always been suspicious of just groups of men because that would mean where are their women? But I took some notes as you spoke. So, you know, that's what I've read about the Basel
Well,
mission and when they first set up. You know, there's
have you seen the play, The Lost Fisherman?
I have not.
Okay, there was a play by Sakakwe a great playwright who actually made a story around this issue of people going fishing on Tuesday against the gods and they got lost. So maybe I'll find out whether, yeah, I'll speak to my friend Pasi and find out whether there's any video or whatever you
This,
can.
this was actually documented, and I'm gonna find the piece. It was actually on one of the pieces that you had shared with me that I
Yeah,
read a few months ago, and this was
okay,
something that I read because it even referenced the name
okay.
of one of the first Ga families that actually converted
Yeah,
to the
okay,
Bastel, and it referenced the Kute family, who I'm familiar
okay.
with, but they were one of some of this book does document them as some of the
Yeah,
early
yeah, yeah.
converts, and the conversion took place in not a very African way. So okay, so that's that, and then you also talked about the um the theocracy,
Yeah.
okay, about the Ga state, and then you kind of aligned the I understand differently the maybe what I would actually call the cosmology of the gods. And my understanding is that the cosmology starts with a supreme creator, similar to the cosmology of nearly every other
Religion.
African tribe. There is a supreme being. And oftentimes this supreme being is androgynous. It's represented by both a male and a female deity. And this is something that a lot of times I make a point to share with other gods because our supreme being, Atana, represents this androgynous supreme being, and the supreme being births Jimawonji, which are all of the elements, the spirits, the fire, water, the animals, and so we call the forest Ejimawon. We call the water Ejimawon. We call certain the supreme beings created are what we call the Jimawonji, the spirits of the Jime. And then subsequently, that's what sits under that is the Ulumo, who would be similar to what the I think the Orish the Yorubas have Babalawo. They call it different names of a healer. But that healer acts as a conduit or a priest essentially. And then within the Ga cosmology, we have the Wonye, who also work within the priesthood. And that serves as our cosmology. But it is similar to a lot of other African tri groups. And it's a what happens is with religion, there is a departure from the androgynous representation of the supreme being. When the Abrahamic religions came into being about 5,000 years, there is a very stark missing part of the supreme for any African, and that is the 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 seemingly the subtraction of the female deity. So I wanted to just kind of touch on that cosmology, but then you also spoke about the the Trinity. Um, the Trinity is taken from the Egyptian story of Osiris, Isis, and Horus. So I guess for me, when I speak to other Africans, whenever there's a conversation about reconciling Christianity um, and African tradition, everyone goes through their experience, and you respect people based on who they are and what they put out, not their beliefs. Beliefs are just far, you know what I mean? So I don't think the two religions can be reconciled because essentially say different things. When the when I read stories about how the Basel set up and how the conversions took place and how, Ie Ama wrote to tell these priests, these are I see Christianity as a total opposite of African traditional religion. It's an offshoot, but it's a bit of an office of it's a bit of a it's different to me, and that's where I sit. But it's fine. I think I
Okay.
think religion serves I think religion serves for something as people. But I guess for me, when I speak to a lot of people who have this African mindset, as you've referenced, you talked about funerals, you talked about naming, you talked about food, you've talked about um, you've talked extensively the theocracy of the gods. A lot of these things, like Aquile Suma and the Twin Festival, that would not sit well within any Christian
Well,
society. When
okay.
you
Let me.
see
Let,
like a shrine. If I come to a shrine and I'm pouring
okay.
libation at the shrine, for example, that would be frowned on from a religious place. If you had a shrine in your home, like I have a shrine in my home, but it is frowned upon by some of my Christian friends who would ask me that why would you have a shrine at your home? But I understand a shrine differently. A shrine to me is like you said, rightfully so, our ancestors, they pass on and we give them money. We give them things to call on the other angels. So I celebrate those things, but those things seem counter to what
But
Christianity says to do.
but they are not. You see, I'll tell you why they are not. And for me, this has been how I sort of resolved all this. Okay. Indeed, I must say with some pride that I there was a time that I thought that I was going to be a priest of the Anglican religion. Okay. I loved the Bible stories. I read them very much so. And I read them because I had sickle cell and I was almost always in hospital. So instead of my school books, my mother always insisted that I had a Bible with you to pray. So I always did very well in religious knowledge, which meant that when I went to sixth form, I also did religious knowledge, and that's when I started probably much deeper in terms of analyzing the gospel and looking at the Old Testament, the first five books, to look at what the Jews were doing. And my most interesting books were the Judges and the Kings. Okay, maybe that's why I have an antipathy towards chieftaincy and monarchy. Okay, and so when I was going to university, I'm also actually thinking very much of going to Trinity College to study religion till I had a discussion with someone who explained to me that a priest is actually a profession and that it had nothing to do with they being men of God, and told me the functions of what those leaders are, and then said that years ago people did not just study for the priesthood, but they were teachers. And then from teachers, they became catechists. And it's when the colonial masters realized that they really knew the Bible that they then took them through the process of ordination. And that, when they were ordained as a priest, there were sort of three main functions. That there was this priestly role, there was this pastoral role, and there was also this role about their preaching. And so everything that they did from Monday to the next Monday was about looking over a flock and then interpreting what is in the Bible to this flock. Okay. So the suggestion is that if I can read the Bible and gain some understanding, the Bible stories are all allegories, essentially parables, as they would say, so that you need to learn things from them. If you read Proverbs, very interesting. It's talking about everyday life and everything. And what I'm saying is that if I can read the Bible, I really don't need a pastor to be the person to be able to interpret it for me, especially if that pastor is doing this interpretation under a cloak of a Western ritual. If I can lend my understanding of what my cosmology is, then I should be able to reconcile that what this guy is saying is something that I can actually find in my own cosmology, although my cosmology is unwritten. So let me come to the marriage ceremony too. Again, I use these rites of passage because I think that they are important. When I got married to my wife, we were both in this country. And my father went through the process of ensuring that she was my wife. Okay? By going to sending my aunties to their house to find out, to say that we're together in England. We'd been together before we both came to England, but we're now coming to formalize it. So we went through the Agboshimo, which is the knocking, and we went through the Yoshibimo. And in later years, I had to actually read about what all this Yoshibimo was about, and why principally it was only women who took part in that ceremony, although these days I'm told that men also find themselves there. But it was a union between two families. An essential ritual is that four women from one side would embrace four women from the other side. And those four women were generational. So a grandmother, a mother, a daughter, and a grandchild, four on one side, embrace the other four from the other side. And that circle that is formed is what becomes the marriage between two families. Most people do not know or understand this. But if you understand, then you'd be able to say that what then happens about the Western form of marriage, or would I say the blessing when people go to church, there's nothing different, because we have our own rituals of creating something that is equally valid. If you don't understand these things, then you would allow a pastor to actually outdoor a Ghana child. So just imagine an Ewe pastor comes to your house to say that I'm doing a dedication of a child and uses olive oil, which we don't have in Ghana, to come and speak to that child in English. Look, we need to be conscious of this charismatic crisis or conflict and be proud that the things that we have are actually superior, because that's what defines us.
When you say the things that we have that define us, are you comparing your church to the charismatic church, or are you comparing African? Are you comparing Ghana culture to the Africa? Because I'm
Well,
trying to understand. As in, are you, because you're talking about the charismatic churches, which, so is
not
it
just
in
the charisma.
comparison to
Okay,
Ghana culture?
okay. What I can actually tell you is that, and I've been told this, and I've asked that years ago in the past, whenever there's after Homowo, when there's Inshobulimo, which is this ritual at the sea where the Wulomo go. to actually talk about getting good catch from the sea. All those things are performed behind where the Anglican Church is at Holy Trinity. And it was said that any time the Wulomwe came, the highest reverend person, Anglobi, as he was then, would actually come, and as the Wulomwe were performing and doing their libation, he would come with his staff, holding his shepherd's staff, to also join in the incantation of that. We also want a good harvest. Okay. Now, if he, an English Anglican priest, can reconcile what Nii Okyne is doing, then who is anybody to actually tell me that what it is that we do in our traditional practices is ungodly or against God? Okay. So if somebody would say that the role of the priests are actually Christopher Wulomo, just like Nii Okyne is a play Wulomo. There's absolutely no, I can actually ease that contradiction at that stage. Because the whole thing about worship, the whole thing about religion, is about looking for prosperity, and it's actually believing that in addition to our strength as humans, there's a supernatural being who helped to order this world, and that if we venerate that supernatural being, things good will happen to us. And the whole course of the Jewish religion is talking about adversity as a result of sin, and prosperity as a result of righteousness. It is this understanding that I have of what my Bible means to me that helps me to say that being a Ga is also a valid way of doing my worship. So anytime I say I go chemeganyeme, tra no manyaba, I have prayed to my God. Because I'm asking a combination of the Supreme Being, a combination of a Jemanwoji, a combination of the ancestors to actually come and endow us and fill us with glory.
Okay.
I have studied the libation texts, and the libation texts are probably no different from when somebody is reciting the articles of faith in the Christian Anglican Church. There is no liturgy in the charismatic church. They say this, take a text and say it several times. They shout it several times. They whip up several lessons. It's more psychological than religious. When I came into this country initially, and I stayed in Manchester, one of the things that were very interesting for me was that I had a couple of Rasta friends. They belonged to the 12 tribes of Israel. And from time to time, African man, they come and knock on my door with their Bible to come and reason. And reason is about their religion, looking at what the Bible holds for them, and reinterpreting the Bible in terms of their suffering, Babylon, etc., etc. And it always amazed me that when they looked at a religious form, they could actually take the Bible and interpret the Bible in their own way. And it's this same Bible which lead them to healthy living, which lead them to what it is that they do within these 12 tribes of Israel religion. That on a
So,
monthly
so,
basis, when they hold their celebrations, what they are all celebrating is hope and prosperity. So the Bible
so
came.
would you urge Gans, Rastas to still maintain the Bible? Would you? I mean, you know, do you think moving forward as a culture, do you think, for example, the Ga people who are, you know, I know a lot of Gans who have a similar view as you, but do you think that this is the way forward for the Ga people to reconcile the two, or do you think that the culture needs to move primarily 100% reflecting what our ancestors knew before?
Well, if I had lived during a time when I had not been conditioned to Christianity, I would probably not have thought about these things. But my thinking about these things has really more to do with how do I reconcile the fact that I was born, I was outdoored, I was baptized, I went through the process of a confirmation because I was Christian. And I got married the traditional way, and I lead my life as a Christian. But I'm saying that leading my life as a Christian does not stop me from being God.
No, but I'm understood. But for the state of the Ga people, we as a people, we are going to move forward. There are
Yeah.
lessons that we're going to impart to the next generation. Do we urge the next generation to go back and to practice as we do? How far back do we take them? Do we now reconcile what it means to be Ga culture with Christianity, with the Bible, or do we
In,
maintain the same raw message and hope that that message gets passed on?
the question that you are asking me is a very difficult question. And I'll tell you why it's difficult. It's very difficult because now we have the prospect of the Wulome, who are chief priests, quoting from the Bible. So anytime you have a discussion, they lead you to the Bible.
Do you find that problematic?
Well, it's
As in, for you, you as an individual, you reconcile it. Why not them? Why is it a problem if they're reconciling the
no, no,
Bible
no, no.
like
It's
you?
not. You are saying that we should go back to. You are asking whether that's really what I'm saying. That is a difficult question because the Wulome of these days also holds the Holy Bible to be a book from which they learn.
And what do you think about that?
Well, I wouldn't expect to learn my Christianity from a Wulomo.
Okay. Okay, but do you think a little more? Okay, well, anyway, I guess that's one way to answer it. I didn't look at
Because
it
that because
that
that
way. I guess
Wulomo, that Wulomo has
yeah,
been
but
also conditioned.
okay, they've been conditioned because okay, so as in you wouldn't take the message from someone that's conditioned. You would take the message from so are you in essence saying that the message that should be imparted to the next generation should be the message that is unconditioned? And if that's the message that's unconditioned, does that
Well,
okay, so is the message that should be passed on the unconditioned message from the Ulamo,
that's yeah,
which is fundamentally devoid of religion. Is that the
exactly
message
right.
that should be passed on?
Because it's not all beliefs that are religions, which is my starting point with who I am, that there are some beliefs that are coalesced together into a religion, but it is not all beliefs that become religion, and it is not all beliefs that end up in public worship, but are beliefs that you can live by as an individual.
Okay. Okay. So what are some of your final thoughts or advice would you like to impart? What would be your
I
final
think,
piece of advice to any of the listeners?
well,
What is
yeah,
your final piece of advice, and what would you like to leave the listeners with?
I think that what we've gone through in this discussion, which has been rather fairly interesting, is that we started about, we're talking about indigenous intelligence. And it shows that one can actually piece a lot of things from our own traditions and customs and actually give meaning to them. So my view is that probably I can't tell everybody to go through my journey in terms of going to learn about who I was. But I think that what I'll tell people is that when we see, when somebody says we are doing something traditional or something cultural, I think that we should actually have some respect for it because it served us very well and it will continue to serve us well. And really, that's my end. This thing that if you know something about yourself, or you know something about where you come from, or you know something about your beliefs, it helps you to mediate this world in a much better and a much safer way. And that it also gives you the confidence, the extreme confidence, for you to be able to actually discuss some of these issues probably in a more enlightening way. And that is not about this or that, because I say this or that because I suspect that some form of Christianity may have borrowed from Judaism, may have borrowed from Mohammedanism or Muslim religion, which is also being pieced together and given to us. But what was transposed to us in Africa was more cultural than religious. Because the point that I was also making is that you take a religion, a book that was created mainly in Rome, given to the Greeks, the Russians and the Eastern people have their version, the Western world have their own version, and then they decide to propagate it and they take it to places and they interpret it within the prism of their own culture. So they come to Africa, it was about colonization. So they said that the only way we can actually push this is to negate what people had as a religion before. They go to South America, and South America finds a way of synthesizing the Christian religion with their old African religions that they practice to create a new form of religion. What I'm saying is that, therefore, the religion of Christianity is really not static, as we should see, and it's sort of become relevant for a different type of world.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So where can the listeners learn more about you and your work?
Where can,
So for anybody that's listening, where can they find you? Where can our listeners learn more about you or your work? I mean,
well, I'm,
you talked about your consultancy and the stuff that you do to
yeah,
promote the. Okay, so I guess you said it, but I guess to wrap up, where would a listener be able to
Oh,
find you in
I
terms of, are
actually
you on the website? Are you on
I actually have
LinkedIn? Are
a
you?
I actually have a website that is dated. My work website is dated for a different reason. It's www.equinoxconsulting.net, but it hasn't been updated for a while. Okay. And it's deliberate. The fact that it's not being updated is deliberate because I'm sort of setting it up as a shrine for my partner who departed this life during the COVID period. We had worked for 38 years uh, together. I mean, and she died. So it's always very painful when I go and try and do things at Equinox. But I also have another website, which is adesawyer.com. And that website I try to update from time to time. So, yes, that's how I can be found. And within that website, I try to write a blog. I haven't written for quite some time, but I intend to now probably be more disciplined in terms of trying to write a blog piece every week. And I write, as I said, on different issues. I write on politics of Africa and Ghana. I write about my Gandangwe identity. And increasingly, I'm writing about sickle cell. And because I'm a passionate patient advocate of it. So if you go to adesawyer.com, you'll find who I am. And it's kind of fairly easy to reach me because if you go online, I'm there. I'm online, and you send me a message through my email address, adesawyer@gmail.com. You'll get to me. But if you want to give me work, which is the work that I do, then you have to do at ade@equinoxconsulting.net. Okay?
Okay. So everyone, take note of the information. Obviously, you can play it back, and then you'll get the information. But look, um, we've talked about doing this session for a while, and I think I've thoroughly enjoyed, listening to your insights, some of what you shared. I think they serve as some really good points for people to further explore, the in-depth knowledge that you have around, the Pujimo, the naming sessions, the marriage, the funeral rites. These are all things that are quite important in terms of maintaining the culture. So, I mean, look, religion aside, however one chooses to live their life, that's ultimately their business. But the truth is, as a man, your contributions to the Ga state in the diaspora, in terms of what you have done to represent the culture here, are obviously significant. And I guess that's what you represent. You said, you had wanted to be a priest, but today you stand here as someone who has, you know, brought the culture to life in the diaspora. So your work is telling in that you continue the work of the ancestors, you continue the work of celebrating those things, and that is what you espouse. So that is who the world sees. The world sees a man rooted in culture. The man doesn't see your religious side. You have to tell somebody that you're religious. But when you walk in the room and you say, "Oh, Chao Mania Bao, Mimbabu Mani," all of these things, represent what we're trying to teach. So the man that you are and the things that you represent are important for all of us to see because they instill pride in all of us to, you know, name our children Ghana names, to take them through the Fujimo, to to represent, our ancestors and all of these things. So it's been thoroughly an enjoyable conversation, and I think um, a lot of what you shared is important, and hopefully it'll inspire someone to be a better person and to go out and to do the work and name their children Ghana names and eat the Ghana food. Yes, eat English food. We all do. At no point did we say don't eat English food, but what we're saying is that our that's another conversation. I'll leave that about the health benefits of our food. But there's obviously a lot of health benefits in eating our foods in comparison to a lot of other Western foods. But thank you very much. It's been a
thank you,
pleasure.
and I think that yeah, I'm going to try and write another article that I can where I would deal a little bit with our cosmology from my own point of view.
That would
So
be interesting
then when
because
I finish, I would come and talk. And then actually, I also have another um, unfinished work that is based on the what I call the origin of the Ghana people, but I take it from a different angle, and I take it from the angle of Ghana, where we are, rather than going delving too much in the past. I so when I finish those, I would sort of send them to you. I hope that I'm able to work on them.
that'd be great. That'd be great. That'd be great. Listen, thank you very much. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll be in
Thank
touch
you.
soon. Thank you.
Thank you.